Imagine a massive criminal syndicate, and they've got, say, $20 million in cash just sitting in a warehouse somewhere.
Right. Just stacks of bills.
Yeah, exactly. And they need to buy a super yacht. Or, perhaps it's a foreign oligarch looking to quietly purchase a block of luxury real estate in London.
They can't exactly just hand over a duffel bag of $100 bills.
No, they can't. I mean, they need the global financial system to think that money came from a chain of completely legitimate, boring businesses.
Right. Needs to look clean.
And so today, we are going to be tearing apart the invisible legal machinery that's actually designed to stop them. We're going to explore why that mundane piece of plastic in your wallet, your everyday driver's license, is actually the frontline weapon in a multi-trillion-dollar war.
It really is a war of attrition, actually. And that plastic ID card is, well, it's merely the entry point into a highly contested battlefield.
Yeah.
The moment you hand it over to open a bank account or to retain a lawyer, you are stepping into this sprawling, high-stakes ecosystem.
So our mission today for this deep dive is to unpack a professional legal brief, exploring the inner workings of what the industry calls know your client, or KYC compliance.
Right, KYC.
And to you listening right now, providing your documentation usually feels like a total nuisance, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's annoying.
It's just an annoying extra step before you can get a business off the ground or open an account. But we're going to break down how your identification is a crucial puzzle piece in protecting the integrity of the entire global financial system.
Yeah, and we need to establish immediately that this is not just some administrative chore.
Right.
It is literally the frontline defense against global fraud, against money laundering syndicates, and the financing of terrorism. Your identity document acts as the anchor point for a system designed to keep the global economy from just being completely overrun by illicit activities.
Okay, so let's start by decoding the alphabet soup that's driving this whole process.
There's a lot of it.
There is. The legal brief points us to two foundational acronyms. So we have KYC and AML. My understanding from the materials is that AML, which is anti-money laundering, that's the broad legal framework. And KYC is the specific operational tool used to actually enforce it.
Exactly. So AML represents the sweeping international and domestic statutes. I mean, the entire purpose of money laundering is to take dirty money.
Like from drug trafficking or corruption?
Yeah, exactly. Funds generated through illegal activities. And they want to wash it through the legitimate financial system. The criminals engage in what the industry calls placement, layering, and integration.
Placement, layering, and integration. Okay, break that down for me.
So first, they place the cash into the system. Then they layer it through all these complex transactions to hide its origin.
Just bouncing it around.
Right. And then finally, they integrate it back into the economy as so-called clean assets, like that super yacht you mentioned.
Ah. Okay.
So KYC is the non-negotiable legal requirement mandating that heavily regulated businesses, particularly in finance and law, verify who they're actually dealing with to make sure they aren't, facilitating that layering process.
I used to think of KYC like a nightclub bouncer checking IDs at the door.
That's a super common analogy.
Right, because you have a business with a legal requirement, say no one under 21. So the bouncer checks the ID, verifies the age, and the patron walks in.
Right.
But that analogy kind of falls apart when you look at the actual regulatory demands in these sources. Because a business cannot just look at a driver's license, tick a box, move on.
No, they really can't. The bouncer analogy fundamentally misunderstands the intent of the law.
How so?
Well, a bouncer checks a static data point, your age, and then they basically cease to care about your behavior.
As long as you're inside.
Yeah. They don't care where you acquired the $50 bill you used to buy a drink.
Yeah.
Or who you plan to meet inside. Or, if you have a history of dismantling nightclubs from the inside out.
Right, that's true.
The legal mandate for KYC defines knowing a client as a dynamic, continuous process.
Wait, so it requires understanding intent, not just identity.
Yes. Absolutely. The institution has to understand your source of wealth, your business models, and this is key, your expected financial behavior.
Expected behavior.
Because sophisticated criminals have virtually limitless resources to produce perfectly authentic-looking identification documents. I mean, if the compliance process just stopped at the door, the entire global AML framework would collapse in a matter of days.
Wow. Okay, but this continuous investigation, it needs a structure, right?
Yes.
And the legal brief breaks this down into a very specific three-pillar architecture of verification.
Right. The three pillars.
So the first pillar is the Customer Identification Program, or CIP. The second is Customer Due Diligence, or CDD. And the third is Ongoing Monitoring.
Exactly. So let's look at the first one. The Customer Identification Program is the foundational baseline.
Okay.
This is your collection of official names, dates of birth, registered addresses, government identification numbers. The legal threshold here is that the institution must have they call it a reasonable belief, that the person is who they claim to be.
Which I would assume reasonable belief is getting a lot harder to establish these days.
Oh, immensely harder.
Especially with the rise of synthetic identities, where criminals combine real Social Security numbers with fake names to create entirely new, non-existent people.
Yeah, that is a massive vulnerability right now, which is exactly why the second pillar, customer due diligence, is so critical.
Okay.
Right. CDD shifts the focus from who are you to why are you here.
Okay, that makes sense.
The compliance officer has to establish a baseline of expected normal behavior. So if a client opens an account for, say, a small local bakery, the CDD profile dictates that the account should primarily see deposits from local credit card processors and outbound payments to, regional flour suppliers.
Meaning, if that same local bakery suddenly receives massive wire transfers from a holding company in the Cayman Islands,
Exactly.
the bank immediately knows something is wrong because the behavior deviates from the CDD baseline.
The deviation is the trigger. And that expected baseline is really the only thing that makes the third pillar, the ongoing monitoring, possible. I mean, without a baseline, you literally cannot identify an anomaly.
But, this continuous monitoring, it creates an incredibly fragile ecosystem, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, at what point does identifying a client turn into actively profiling their risk? Because ongoing monitoring sounds indistinguishable from constant surveillance.
Well, the transition from the identification phase to active risk assessment is basically instantaneous.
Really? Day one?
From day one,
Yeah.
an institution is legally obligated to categorize the risk you pose to the broader financial system.
Wow.
Part of that calculation comes from the nature of your business, but a substantial portion involves continuous screening against global databases, specifically international sanctions watch lists and politically exposed persons or PPES lists.
Okay, so sanctions watch lists make intuitive sense to me. If an individual is a known terrorist or a sanctioned oligarch, they are flagged, and the institution is prohibited from engaging with them.
Right. Simple enough.
But the PEP designation, that seems far more nuanced in the sources. They define a politically exposed person as someone holding a prominent public function. So politicians, senior government officials, judicial figures.
Yeah. And the risk associated with the PP is not an assumption of inherent criminality.
Right, that's not saying they're bad guys.
Exactly. The risk is tied to their vulnerability. Their position provides them with these unique opportunities to generate illicit funds through bribery or corruption or the direct misappropriation of state assets.
Just because of their access?
Right. Therefore, the financial system have to subject their transactions to a drastically higher level of scrutiny.
Well, I want to dig into the mechanics of that screening, because it doesn't just stop at the politician.
No, it definitely doesn't.
The sources indicate this extends to immediate family members and close business associates.
Yes, it spreads out.
So, okay, let's say I run a completely legitimate, low-risk software company, but my sister suddenly gets elected to a national legislature. Does my personal risk profile automatically shift?
Your risk profile is immediately elevated, yes.
Just like that.
Just like that. Because the law recognizes that corrupt officials rarely hoard illicit funds in personal bank accounts under their own names.
Right, that would be dumb.
Right. They funnel the money through trusted proxies. So your sister's new position means you are now considered a potential conduit for state corruption.
Wow.
This illustrates perfectly why the law demands ongoing monitoring rather than just a static check at the door. Your status changed overnight, and you didn't do anything differently in your own business.
The technical infrastructure required to monitor the siblings of every mid-level bureaucrat on Earth, that must be staggering.
Oh, it is. It relies on incredibly complex, fuzzy matching algorithms.
Fuzzy matching?
Yeah, the system isn't just looking for exact name matches. It's scanning global news databases, public registries, corporate filings, all to map out the relational networks of every known PE.
That's intense.
So if an automated system flags a connection between your software company's accounts and your sister's new political sphere, it triggers a mandatory human review.
Okay, so if the system is constantly scanning like this,
Mhm.
what happens when a single regional bank or, a boutique law firm decides to just cut corners to save money?
Well,
Because the stakes here, according to the brief, are global terrorism and massive state-level fraud. A compliance failure has to be met with more than just a stern warning.
oh, absolutely. Failing to comply with KYC regulations carries some of the most catastrophic consequences in the corporate world. I mean, without rigorous enforcement, the financial system just becomes a sieve.
Right. I look at it like a city's water supply.
That's a good way to picture it.
If one local treatment plant allows a highly toxic pollutant into the pipes,
Right.
it doesn't matter how clean the rest of the facilities are.
It could-
Everyone downstream is going to drink it.
Yes, because once illicit funds successfully bypass the KYC filters at a single vulnerable institution, they enter the clean system.
They're in the water.
Right. And from there, the criminals can freely transfer, invest, and mix those funds with legitimate capital until the original taint is mathematically impossible to trace.
That's terrifying.
It is. And that is exactly why regulators employ a scorched earth policy regarding compliance failures.
We're talking about financial penalties reaching into the billions of dollars, right? Alongside severe regulatory sanctions that can literally revoke an institution's license to operate in key global markets.
Yes.
And the sources also explicitly mention criminal liability.
Yes. Individuals can and do face prison time for failing to maintain these safeguards.
Prison time for paperwork?
Well, it's more than paperwork, as we've established, but yes. But this regulatory sledgehammer creates a profound structural friction, specifically within the legal profession.
Yes, our sources highlight a massive tension here between a lawyer's strict regulatory obligations and the fundamental principle of client confidentiality.
It's a huge conflict.
Because the attorney-client privilege is the bedrock of the legal system, right? A client must be able to speak to their legal counsel with total candor.
Absolutely.
But KYC is fundamentally about generating total transparency for the state. You cannot be a confidential advisor and a government gatekeeper simultaneously without one of those roles completely collapsing.
And regulators have firmly decided which role has to yield.
They have.
They argue that legal safeguards, like attorney-client privilege, simply cannot be permitted to serve as an impenetrable shield for criminal enterprises. The system demands that lawyers act as the first line of defense. They are legally obligated to vet a client's financial history before the relationship truly begins.
But wait, if a lawyer uncovers something suspicious during that vetting process, what is the actual mechanism for reporting it? Do they just, call the police and say, hey, my client is a money launderer?
No. The mechanism is a formal document known as a suspicious activity report, or a SAR. Yeah. If a legal professional suspects a client is attempting to facilitate money laundering, the confidentiality privilege often just disintegrates. They are required by law to file a SAR with financial intelligence authorities.
And the most controversial aspect of this, according to the brief, is the concept of tipping off.
Oh, tipping off is heavily debated.
Because the lawyer is legally prohibited from informing the client that they have filed this report.
Right. The logic behind the tipping off prohibition is entirely tactical. I mean, think about it. If a client knows they're under investigation, what's their immediate reaction going to be?
Asset flight.
Exactly. They will wire the funds to an uncooperative jurisdiction, destroy their digital records, and basically vanish before authorities can secure a freeze order.
Ah.
So the law forces the lawyer to maintain the facade of a normal professional relationship, all while actively passing intelligence to the state.
Which means we are looking at a system where the state forces private citizens to conduct covert surveillance on their own clients under threat of imprisonment.
That's one way to frame it, yes.
I mean, it is easy to see why civil liberties groups view this as an aggressive expansion of state power into private relationships, even while acknowledging the necessity of stopping financial crime.
Yeah, that tension is basically the defining characteristic of modern compliance. But regulators point to the reality of how modern crime operates.
How so?
Bad actors specifically target law firms because a trust or a corporate entity that's set up by a prestigious law firm, it carries a halo of legitimacy.
It looks clean by association.
Exactly. Forcing lawyers to execute KYC ensures the water supply isn't poisoned directly at the source.
Okay, so moving from the theory of all this to the actual execution, how do legal professionals actually peel back these layers? Because collecting a name and checking a passport is simple, but we've established that the criminals are hiding.
They are, and the legal framework requires professionals to dismantle what is essentially a matryoshka doll of legal liability.
A Russian nesting doll.
Yes, criminals do not operate under their own names. They construct layers of corporate entities explicitly designed to exploit the gaps in international law.
Right.
So the baseline data, the company name, the registered address, that is virtually meaningless for risk assessment.
It's just the outer doll.
Exactly. The law demands that professionals identify the key individuals driving the entity, such as the board of directors and the CEO.
But even the CEO of a shell company is often just a proxy, right? Like a paid signatory who has no real power. The true objective, according to our sources, is identifying the ultimate beneficial owner, the UBO.
The UBO is everything. The UBO is the natural person.
Natural person meaning?
It must be a living, breathing human being, not another corporate entity. It has to be the actual person who exercises ultimate control over the funds or the assets.
Okay, walk me through a scenario. Let's say I'm a compliance officer at a London law firm.
Okay.
And a new corporate client wants to purchase a £50 million commercial property.
All right, so you begin with the entity attempting to make the purchase. Let's say it's a limited liability company registered in Delaware.
Okay, Delaware.
You pull the public registry. But Delaware allows for immense corporate secrecy, so the true owner isn't listed.
Right.
The only information you find points to a parent company. And let's say that's a holding corporation registered in the Cayman Islands.
So I have to pivot my investigation to the Caymans. I pull the corporate registry there, assuming I can even get access to it.
And when you do access the Cayman registry, you discover the holding corporation is entirely owned by an opaque offshore trust.
Oh, boy.
And at this point, the public trail is dead. You cannot simply document that the trust owns the money and move on. The law requires you to escalate your investigation and demand direct documentation from the client.
I would assume this is where official documentation like a certificate of good standing comes into play, to prove these entities actually legally exist and aren't just names on a fake letterhead.
Yes, a certificate of good standing, which is issued by a government authority like a state registry, is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It confirms the company is legally registered, currently active, and hasn't been dissolved for failing to pay taxes.
Okay.
However, a certificate only proves the shell exists.
Right, it doesn't tell you who is inside it.
Exactly. It tells you nothing about the funds flowing through it. So you must utilize exhaustive KYC questionnaires, literally forcing the client to map out the entire organizational chart.
Wow.
You must demand the trust deeds, identify the settlor of the trust, the beneficiaries, and the trustees.
And what if they refuse? If they say the trust is strictly confidential?
Then the transaction dies on the desk.
Just like that.
Just like that. The absolute bedrock rule of KYC compliance is that if you cannot definitively identify the UBO, you are legally barred from conducting business with the entity.
Period.
Period.
But even when you do get the documents, the paper trail itself can be a total minefield. The sources emphasize the critical importance of navigating red flags.
Right.
And a red flag isn't like definitive proof of a crime, but it indicates the behavioral baseline is skewed.
Yeah.
The brief gives a very specific example here, the offshore mismatch. This is when a business operating in one country maintains its primary bank accounts in a completely different jurisdiction.
Right. So imagine a company presenting itself as a domestic construction firm.
Okay.
Based solely in London, servicing local UK clients.
Okay.
Yet when it comes time to process payments, they insist all funds must be routed to a corporate account located in Cyprus or maybe the British Virgin Islands.
Here's the thing. I run a global online consulting business, and my primary banking is in a different country from where I live. Right. Simply because their multi-currency accounts save me thousands in exchange fees. From an entrepreneurial perspective, treating efficient tax or currency optimization as inherently suspicious is incredibly frustrating.
And that frustration is universal in the business community. It really is.
I bet.
But the distinction for a compliance officer is the legal threshold between legitimate commercial optimization and deliberate layering. A red flag is simply a demand for an explanation. The offshore mismatch is a classic technique used to obscure the origin of funds by forcing investigators to cross international borders, navigate different legal systems, and overcome language barriers.
So the compliance officer's job is to prove my explanation is the truth.
Yes.
Well, what is the actual standard of proof? Because they can't just take my word for it over a phone call.
No, they must execute a rigorous forensic process. The client's narrative must perfectly align with the underlying documentation.
So if I say it's for currency exchange,
Then if you claim the offshore account is for currency optimization due to international software contractors, the professional will demand a written business rationale.
okay.
And more importantly, they require independent verification.
Meaning they bypass the client entirely and go straight to the foreign bank.
Yes, third-party confirmation is the gold standard here. They will request authenticated documentation directly from the foreign institution to verify the account ownership and to confirm the specific individuals who hold authorized access to move the funds. If the bank statements show millions of dollars flowing into an anonymous trust instead of regular payments to software developers, well, the narrative collapses and a SAR is likely filed.
This brings us to a critical friction point highlighted in the sources: bureaucracy versus the evolving threat.
It's a huge issue.
Because lawyers are demanding endless third-party documents, they're tracing multinational corporate structures, and demanding business rationales for mundane financial decisions. The compliance burden on smaller legal firms and regional banks, it has to be suffocating in terms of cost and manpower.
It absolutely is. The business world heavily criticizes KYC as an overly bureaucratic drag on global commerce.
I mean, clients are furious at the repetitive nature of the process.
Constant repetition.
You must surrender your entire financial history to open a bank account, surrender it again to engage an accountant, and then surrender it a third time to hire a lawyer.
Yeah. And here is the cynical reality that drives that frustration. Despite billions of dollars spent globally on KYC compliance every single year, international bodies estimate that less than 1% of illicit global financial flows are actually intercepted by law enforcement.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
If sophisticated bad actors are simply building more complex shell companies and hiring corrupt intermediaries to forge better documents, is this immense burden on small firms just costly performance art?
It is a staggering statistic, I agree. And it fuels the argument that the current framework is completely failing.
It sounds like it is.
But viewing KYC as performance art ignores its true function. It was never designed to be a silver bullet that entirely eradicates financial crime.
Okay.
Criminals are incredibly well-funded and constantly evolving. KYC is a structural deterrent.
A deterrent.
Think of it as a sophisticated security system on a high-value facility. A highly determined professional infiltration team might still bypass the alarms, but that does not render the locks useless.
Because the locks filter out the opportunistic criminals, and they fundamentally change the math for the professionals.
Exactly. By enforcing a strict global KYC standard, regulators force bad actors to utilize vastly more complex, multi-layered structures.
Right.
A cartel can no longer just walk into a New York bank with a suitcase of cash. They are forced to spend millions establishing holding companies in non-extradition jurisdictions, hiring proxy directors, and fabricating massive volumes of shipping invoices.
So the system works by artificially inflating the cost, the time, and the risk of operating an illegal enterprise.
Yes.
And the more complex their structure becomes to bypass the KYC filters, the more jurisdictional borders they have to cross, which inevitably leaves a broader paper trail for law enforcement to eventually follow.
The friction is the point.
The friction is the point. I like that.
However, the system is reaching a breaking point regarding the burden it places on legitimate businesses. The future of compliance, as detailed in our sources, relies heavily on a massive technological shift away from photocopy passports and manual document reviews.
Thank goodness for that. The brief highlights digital identity verification, biometric authentication, and AI-driven risk analysis as the core drivers of this evolution. Let's look at digital identity first. Because the current model of emailing sensitive PDFs to 5 different professionals, that is a massive data security risk and horribly inefficient.
That's a nightmare for data security. The technological goal here is the creation of secure, centralized digital identity credentials that are cryptographically verified.
How would that work for the client?
Instead of a lawyer manually reviewing a physical utility bill, the client authorizes a biometric release, perhaps a facial scan on their device.
Oh, like unlocking your phone.
Exactly. And that grants the professional instant access to a verified, tamper-proof digital profile that has already been authenticated by a central authority.
That immediately solves the repeated requests problem
And
and removes the human error of manual document verification.
yes,
But the incorporation of AI into the ongoing monitoring and risk analysis phases, that feels like a much deeper structural change.
it's a fundamental paradigm shift. Regulators recognize that treating every client with the same manual scrutiny is a tremendous waste of resources.
Right.
So the industry is moving toward a risk-based approach, and AI is the engine capable of executing that at a global scale.
So instead of thoroughly patting down every single passenger at the airport, we are using AI to analyze 1,000 behavioral data points to determine who actually requires a second look.
That's a perfect analogy. The algorithms can ingest vast data sets, transaction histories, geographical data, subtle corporate affiliations across multiple registries, and even real-time negative news screening.
Wow.
And they use all that to dynamically assign and adjust a client's risk score in milliseconds.
In milliseconds.
Yeah. This allows human compliance officers to pivot their energy away from checking the boxes on those low-risk bakeries we talked about earlier and focus their expertise entirely on complex threat analysis.
But I mean, relying on machine learning to determine a client's risk profile introduces terrifying blind spots, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
Because AI models are infamous for inheriting the biases of their training data. If an algorithm incorrectly flags my legitimate global e-commerce business as a high risk for money laundering due to, say, an obscure geographical data point, how do I argue with a black box?
You've hit on the most critical unresolved issue in the future of compliance: the opacity of these algorithms.
Yeah.
When an institution executes a process known as de-risking, where they abruptly close your accounts and sever the relationship because the AI flagged you as an unacceptable risk, they're legally prohibited from explaining the algorithm's reasoning to you.
Because of the tipping off rules.
Exactly, because of the tipping off rules.
That's wild. A business owner could be financially exiled from the global banking system by an automated algorithm, and they would have zero legal recourse to demand an explanation, let alone correct the data.
Right.
The technology solves the efficiency crisis, but it creates a totally dystopian paradigm regarding accountability.
We are essentially replacing the friction of paperwork with the friction of algorithmic opacity.
We have covered immense ground in our analysis of these sources today. The foundational takeaway here is that KYC is far more than the administrative nuisance it appears to be.
It really is.
It is a vital, dynamic legal safeguard.
It is an architecture built on identification, due diligence, and continuous monitoring. And it forces institutions into a constant balancing act between protecting client privacy and enforcing the transparency required to protect the global economy.
Right. It requires peeling back the Matryoshka doll of legal liability to find the real human being pulling the strings. It means forensically navigating the red flags of international commerce and systematically raising the cost of operations for criminal syndicates.
Because knowing your client is the core mechanism for establishing trust in a system where capital moves at the speed of light.
So the next time you are sitting across from a professional and they ask you to slide that plastic ID across the desk, consider the ecosystem you are engaging with. Your participation is an active contribution to a global web of transparency that keeps the financial system afloat.
And as we transition into an era governed by algorithmic risk scoring and biometric data, we really must critically evaluate the architecture we are building.
Absolutely.
Because when the decision of whether you are allowed to participate in the global economy is automated, who ultimately holds the power over your financial trustworthiness? Is it the legal institutions? Is it the algorithms? Or is it you?